Colorado Territory, 1873. The snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains cut a jagged line across the horizon as Lucille Garrett stood on the rickety platform of the Clearwater Springs train station. Her gloved hands trembled, though not from the crisp autumn air. The letter crinkled in her pocket, the one that had brought her halfway across the country to marry a man she'd never met. Last stop, Clearwater Springs, the conductor called, his voice nearly lost in the hiss of steam. Lucille gathered her modest carpetbag and her courage. At 22, she had left behind the whispers of Boston society, where plump girls like her were relegated to spinsterhood or loveless marriages to widowers 3 times their age. Her mother had called this journey west your only chance, Lucille, with that familiar mix of pity and disappointment. The station was nearly empty as passengers dispersed quickly. No one waited for her. The rancher who had answered her advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette, one Derek Whitaker of the Double W Ranch, had promised to meet her, but the platform stood empty save for an old station master and a young boy selling newspapers. "Excuse me." Lucille approached the station master. "I'm looking for Mr. Derek Whitaker. Has he been by today?" The old man's eyebrows rose slightly as he assessed her, taking in her fashionable but travel-worn dress, her full figure, and her honey-blonde hair escaping its pins after 3 days on the train. "Whitaker, you say? Young Derek's been in town earlier, miss. Mentioned fetching a bride." He glanced at the empty platform. Though that was hours ago. Lucille's stomach knotted. Had he seen her through the train window and changed his mind? Her correspondence with Derek had been brief but promising. She'd been careful to describe herself honestly, perhaps too honestly, calling herself a woman of substantial build with culinary talents to match. "Perhaps I could direct you to the hotel," the station master offered kindly. "It's just down the main street. Can't miss it." With a nod of thanks, Lucille made her way into town, painfully aware of curious glances from locals. Clearwater Springs was modest by Eastern standards, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, muddy side streets, and the promise of wilderness beyond. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as she approached the Imperial Hotel, a 2-story structure with peeling paint but clean windows. The lobby was empty except for a thin, stern-looking woman behind the desk who introduced herself as Mrs. Pemberton, the proprietress. "I'm waiting for Mr. Whitaker," Lucille explained. "We have an arrangement." Understanding dawned in Mrs. Pemberton's eyes. "Another mail-order bride," she said, not unkindly. "That's the 3rd this year for Clearwater Springs." "Do you know Mr. Whitaker?" Lucille asked hopefully. "Young Derek? Of course. Everyone knows everyone here." Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened slightly. "He's a good man. Inherited the Double W when his father passed last winter. Been running it alone since." Before Lucille could inquire further, the hotel door burst open. A young man strode in, removing his hat to reveal tousled chestnut hair. His face was handsome, strong-jawed with clear blue eyes, and while his clothes were those of a working rancher, they were clean and well-kept. A light stubble shadowed his jaw, and his tall frame carried the lean muscle of someone who worked the land daily. His eyes found Lucille immediately, widening slightly. "Miss Garrett?" he asked, his voice deeper than she had imagined from his letters. "Mr. Whitaker," she replied, willing her voice not to shake. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten our arrangement." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, extending a calloused hand. "My apologies. One of my hands broke his arm this morning. I've been with the doctor." His smile was tentative but genuine. "Welcome to Clearwater Springs." As they shook hands, Lucille felt the warmth of his grip, noted the sincerity in his eyes, but also caught the brief flicker of surprise, perhaps disappointment, as he took in her appearance. She had been truthful in her letters about her size, but perhaps he hadn't truly understood. "I've arranged for you to stay here tonight," he said, releasing her hand. "The Reverend can marry us tomorrow, if that suits." The abruptness of his statement startled her. "Tomorrow? So soon?" Derek looked confused. "Isn't that why you came? For us to be married?" "Yes, but," Lucille faltered. "In Boston, courting took months, even years. Here in the West, practical matters seem to outweigh sentimentality. I thought we might take some time to become acquainted first." A flush crept up Derek's neck. "Of course. Forgive me. I didn't mean to rush you." He cleared his throat. "Perhaps you would join me for dinner this evening? At 7? The hotel dining room serves a decent meal." I would like that, she replied, relieved at the reprieve. As Derek turned to leave, promising to return later, Lucille couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake in coming. The look in his eyes when he'd first seen her had confirmed her deepest fear, that even here, thousands of miles from Boston society, her size would be an insurmountable obstacle to finding love. Mrs. Pemberton showed Lucille to a small but clean room where she unpacked her meager belongings and changed into her best dress, a deep blue with modest lace at the collar. She arranged her honey blonde hair in a simple style and pinched her cheeks for color, wondering if any amount of preparation could make a difference. At precisely 7, Lucille descended to the hotel dining room, where Derek waited at a corner table. He stood as she approached, pulling out her chair with unexpected gallantry. "You look lovely, Miss Garrett," he said, though his eyes didn't quite meet hers. The dining room was sparsely populated, a few traveling salesmen, an older couple, and a table of rowdy cowboys who fell momentarily silent as Lucille entered, their stares burning into her back. Derek must have noticed her discomfort. "Pay them no mind," he said quietly. "They're just passing through." A waitress brought 2 plates of roast beef with potatoes and carrots. As they ate, Derek asked about her journey west, and Lucille found herself relaxing as she described the changing landscape, the fascinating passengers, and the small adventures of train travel. "And what of Boston?" Derek asked. "What made you leave?" Lucille hesitated, pushing a potato around her plate. "Limited prospects," she finally answered. "My father died 3 years ago, leaving my mother and me with little. My mother has since remarried, and her new husband has limited patience for stepdaughters." Derek nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And why answer my advertisement specifically? Surely a Boston lady had many options." "Fewer than you might think," Lucille said, attempting lightness in her tone. "And your letter stood out. You mentioned wanting someone who could make a home, not just decorate one. I did write that, didn't I?" A smile touched Derek's lips, revealing a small dimple in his left cheek. "The double W needs a woman's touch. It's been empty since my mother passed 5 years ago." Their conversation continued, finding easier rhythms as the dinner progressed. Derek spoke of his ranch, 800 acres with a small herd of cattle and a promising horse breeding operation. He described the whitewashed farmhouse his father had built, the garden his mother had loved, the spectacular views of the mountains. As they finished their meal, one of the cowboys from the noisy table staggered past, clearly deep in his cups. He stumbled near their table, catching himself on the back of Lucille's chair. "Well, Whitaker," the man slurred, "this your mail-order bride?" His bloodshot eyes raked over Lucille. "Got yourself a big one, didn't ya? Plenty to hold on to in the winter." The dining room fell silent. Lucille's face burned with humiliation. Derek's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist on the tablecloth. "Apologize to the lady, Hank," Derek said quietly, a dangerous edge to his voice. I meant no harm," the drunken cowboy protested, swaying slightly. "Just never seen Whitaker here with a woman before, let alone such a substantial one." Derek was on his feet in an instant, his chair clattering backward. "I said apologize." The cowboy's face darkened. "Make me, boy." What happened next was so quick Lucille barely had time to gasp. Derek's fist connected with the cowboy's jaw, sending him sprawling across the floor. The man's companions rose halfway from their chairs, but something in Derek's stance made them reconsider. "We're leaving," Derek said to Lucille, his voice controlled despite the anger evident in his eyes. He dropped coins on the table for their meal, helped Lucille from her chair, and guided her toward the exit. Outside, the night air was cool against Lucille's flushed skin. Tears threatened, but she refused to let them fall. This humiliation was exactly what she had fled Boston to escape. "I'm sorry about that," Derek said stiffly as they walked slowly down the boardwalk. "Hank Taylor works for the Sullivan Ranch. He's always been trouble." "You didn't need to defend me," Lucille said, her voice small. "I'm accustomed to such comments." Derek stopped walking, turning to face her in the dim light from a nearby window. "No one should become accustomed to disrespect, Miss Garrett." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence filled with unasked questions. "I should return to the hotel," Lucille finally said. Derek nodded. "I'll call for you at 10 tomorrow morning, if that's agreeable. I thought I might show you the ranch before." before we make any decisions." "That would be wise," Lucille agreed, relieved he wasn't pressing for an immediate wedding. He walked her back to the hotel entrance. "Good night, Miss Garrett." "Good night, Mr. Whitaker." Alone in her room, Lucille sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day swirling in her mind. Derek Whitaker was not what she had expected, younger, handsomer, and seemingly kinder than she had dared hope. But the incident in the dining room had only reinforced what she already knew. Her appearance would always make her an object of ridicule, even here in the West where women were scarce. Perhaps, she thought as she readied for bed, it would be best to be honest with Derek tomorrow, to tell him she understood if he wished to void their arrangement. After all, what man wanted a wife who brought mockery upon him? The morning dawned clear and crisp. Lucille dressed in her most practical outfit, a brown skirt and white shirtwaist, anticipating the visit to the ranch. At precisely 10, Derek arrived with a wagon, looking refreshed in clean denims and a blue shirt that matched his eyes. The drive to the Double W took nearly an hour, giving them time to observe each other in the clear light of day. Derek pointed out landmarks along the way, the creek that never ran dry, the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring, the distant mountains whose names he taught her. "There it is," he finally said, gesturing ahead as they crested a hill. The Double W. The ranch spread before them, a modest but well-maintained house with a wide porch, several outbuildings, corrals with horses, and beyond, the rolling pasture land where cattle grazed. It wasn't grand like the Boston estates Lucille had admired from afar, but it was beautiful in its honest functionality. Derek guided the wagon to the house and helped Lucille down, his strong hands at her waist momentarily before he stepped back, a slight flush on his cheeks. "It's not much," he said, suddenly seeming younger, less sure of himself. "But it's mine, free and clear." "It's lovely," Lucille replied honestly, drawn to the homey appeal of the whitewashed house with its blue shutters. Derek showed her around the property, the barn with its sweet-smelling hay, the chicken coop where hens clucked contentedly, the vegetable garden now mostly harvested for winter. Two ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully as Derek introduced Lucille, their curious gazes quickly averted. Finally, they entered the house. The front door opened directly into a large living area with a stone fireplace and sturdy, if plain, furniture. A doorway led to a spacious kitchen with a cast-iron stove, wooden countertops worn smooth with use, and a large table at its center. "My mother loved this kitchen," Derek said, watching Lucille as she ran her hand along the well-used countertop. She could feed 12 ranch hands and still have energy to bake pies afterward. Lucille smiled, imagining the room filled with warmth and activity. "It's a wonderful kitchen." Derek showed her the rest of the house, 3 bedrooms upstairs, including the master bedroom with its handmade quilt and the smaller room that had been his as a boy. Everything was clean but showed signs of bachelor living. Functionality without comfort or beauty. They ended the tour on the front porch, where 2 rocking chairs faced the spectacular view. Derek gestured for Lucille to sit, then settled into the chair beside her. For several minutes, they simply rocked in silence, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Lucille felt a strange peace here, despite the uncertainty of her situation. This place could become home, she realized. If only. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, gathering her courage. "I feel I must address something directly." Derek turned to her, his expression open. "Please, call me Derek." "Derek, then." Lucille took a deep breath. "I was honest in my letters about my appearance, but I understand if the reality is disappointing. Last night at dinner, I saw how uncomfortable that man's comments made you. I would understand if you wished to cancel our arrangement." Derek's brow furrowed. "Is that what you want? To cancel our arrangement?" "No," Lucille admitted. "But I don't want your pity either." Derek was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes searching hers. "Miss Garrett." "Lucille, I wasn't uncomfortable because of you last night. I was angry at Hank's disrespect." He leaned forward in his chair. "I wrote to you because your letters showed intelligence, practicality, and kindness, qualities I value. Your description of yourself was forthright, which I respected. But surely you hoped for someone more conventionally attractive." Lucille pressed, needing the truth between them. Derek's laugh surprised her, not mocking, but genuinely amused. "Lucille, look around you. This is a working ranch. I need a partner, not a delicate ornament. His face grew serious again. My father always said he married my mother for her laugh, her cooking, and her good sense. In that order. He said beauty fades, but a woman who can make you laugh and fill your belly will keep you happy all your days. Lucille felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. Still, years of insecurity couldn't be dismissed so easily. I appreciate your kindness, Derek, but I've heard the whispers all my life. No one marries a fat girl, sir. But I can cook, she quoted, the words bitter on her tongue. That's what my mother's friends would say, thinking I couldn't hear them. That my only hope was to find a man who valued my domestic skills enough to overlook everything else. Derek's expression hardened, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A slow, genuine smile that transformed his face. Well then, they were fools, he said simply. And if you can cook half as well as you claim, I'd consider myself fortunate indeed. Lucille stared at him, searching for any sign of insincerity but finding none. May I be direct, Lucille? He asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, bracing herself. I lost my mother when I was 17. My father retreated into himself afterward. For 5 years, this house hasn't been a home, just a place to sleep between workdays. His blue eyes held her steadily. I want a wife who will fill this house with warmth again, who will be my partner in building something meaningful. I want children someday, a family gathered around that kitchen table. He reached across the space between them, hesitantly taking her hand. I won't pretend to feel love yet. We barely know each other. But I like what I see in you, Lucille Garrett. I like your honesty, your courage in coming all this way. And yes, I find you beautiful. Lucille's breath caught. No man had ever called her beautiful before. I propose this, Derek continued. Stay here for 2 weeks. Get to know the ranch and me. If at the end of that time, you wish to return to Boston, I'll pay for your ticket myself, no questions asked. But if you find you could be happy here, as my wife, then we'll be married. The offer was more generous than she had expected, giving her both time and a graceful exit if needed. And if you decide you don't want me after 2 weeks? She asked, needing to know. Derek's hand tightened on hers. I won't, he said with such quiet certainty that Lucille almost believed him. Very well, she agreed. 2 weeks. The next morning, Lucille moved her few belongings into the guest bedroom at the Double W. Derek had arranged for Mrs. Pemberton's niece, a young widow named Sarah, to stay as well, providing both companionship and propriety. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Lucille rose early, preparing breakfast for Derek and the ranch hands. She spent her mornings learning the workings of the house, where supplies were kept, how the temperamental stove operated, which floorboards creaked. In the afternoons, Derek would often find time to show her more of the ranch, the best spot for picking berries, the grove of aspens that turned golden in fall, the secret swimming hole where he'd spent childhood summers. True to her word, Lucille cooked. She prepared hearty stews, fresh bread, apple pies with cinnamon, and biscuits that melted in the mouth. The ranch hands, initially wary of her presence, soon began lingering at the table, offering shy compliments on her cooking. Best meal I've had since my mama's kitchen, old Pete, the longest-serving hand, declared after a particularly successful dinner of roast chicken and dumplings. Derek said little during these meals, but Lucille often caught him watching her, not with criticism, but with something like wonder as she transformed his bachelor kitchen into a place of comfort and sustenance. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch if weather permitted, or by the fire when it didn't, talking long into the night. Derek told her of his childhood on the ranch, of learning to ride before he could walk, of his father's stern but fair guidance, of his mother's gentle influence. Lucille shared stories of Boston, the library she had loved, the harbor at sunrise, the lectures and concerts she had attended when funds permitted. She spoke less often of her family, though Derek noticed the omission. You rarely mention your mother, he observed one evening as they sat before the fire, a chessboard between them. Were you close? Lucille moved her knight, capturing one of his pawns. Not particularly. She was always concerned with appearances, with fitting into society. I was a disappointment in that regard. Because of your size? Derek asked directly, his gaze steady on her face. Yes. Lucille met his eyes, refusing to flinch. I was always the large Garrett girl at social functions. Mother tried everything: restrictive diets, tight corsets, even bitter tonics from questionable doctors. Nothing changed, and eventually, she seemed to give up hope of making an advantageous match for me. Derek frowned, moving his bishop across the board. That seems a cold way to regard one's daughter. She wasn't unkind, Lucille clarified. Just practical. When I saw your advertisement in the Gazette, she encouraged me to respond. Said the West might be more forgiving of my unfortunate figure. She smiled wryly. Not exactly a mother's blessing, but as close as I was likely to get. Check, Derek said, his rook threatening her king. As Lucille studied the board, he added quietly, "For what it's worth, I think your figure is perfectly fortunate." Lucille's head snapped up to find Derek watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. She looked back at the chessboard quickly, moving her king out of danger. "Your move," she murmured. The days passed quickly. Lucille found herself adapting to ranch life with surprising ease. She learned to gather eggs without frightening the hens, to churn butter until her arms ached, to preserve the last of the garden's bounty for winter. She also learned about Derek, how his brow furrowed when he concentrated, how he sang softly to nervous horses, how he treated every person on his ranch with respect regardless of position. She watched him work alongside his men, not above the dirtiest tasks despite being the owner. One afternoon in the second week, Lucille was kneading dough for bread when she heard commotion outside. Looking through the window, she saw Derek and two hands struggling with a heifer in obvious distress. Without thinking, she wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and hurried outside. "What's happened?" she called. Derek glanced up, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool day. "Calf's coming, but it's turned wrong. She's in trouble." Lucille had never attended a calving, but she'd read about them in one of the books from Derek's small library. "How can I help?" Derek hesitated only a moment. "Boil water, bring clean cloths. And if you've got a strong stomach, we could use another pair of hands." To her own surprise, Lucille did have a strong stomach. For the next hour, she assisted as Derek reached into the heifer to turn the calf, following his instructions to support the mother, to pass tools, to wipe away blood and fluid. When the calf finally emerged, a small, wet thing with spindly legs, the triumph on Derek's face matched the elation in her own heart. "You did it," she breathed, watching as the mother cow began to lick her newborn. "We did it," Derek corrected, his smile tired but genuine as he wiped his hands. Not many women would wade into a difficult calving without hesitation. That evening, bone-weary but satisfied, they sat closer than usual before the fire, the shared experience having dissolved some invisible barrier between them. "Only 3 days left," Derek said quietly, breaking a comfortable silence. Lucille's heart quickened. She had been avoiding thoughts of the deadline, of the decision that loomed before her. "Yes," she acknowledged. "Have you been happy here, Lucille?" His voice was carefully neutral. She considered the question honestly. "Happier than I expected to be," she admitted. "The ranch is beautiful, the work satisfying." She hesitated, then added softly, "And the company has been pleasant." A smile played at the corners of Derek's mouth. "Pleasant? I've been aiming higher than pleasant." Lucille laughed, the tension broken. "Very well. The company has been exceptional." Derek's expression grew serious again. "And have you decided? About staying?" Lucille looked into the fire, watching the flames dance. "I'm still considering," she said truthfully. While her heart increasingly urged her to stay, her mind still harbored doubts. "And you? Have you decided if you still want me as your wife?" Derek was quiet so long that Lucille feared his answer. Finally, he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I knew my answer the moment you rolled up your sleeves to help with that calf," he said. "You belong here, Lucille. With the ranch. With me." The certainty in his voice nearly undid her. "How can you be so sure? We've known each other less than 2 weeks." "Some things don't need long to recognize," he replied. "My father said he knew he would marry my mother the first time she laughed at one of his jokes. Said it was like sunrise after a long night." Lucille's throat tightened with emotion. "And have I been your sunrise, Derek Whitaker?" He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Every day since you arrived." The next morning, Lucille woke early, her mind made up. She would stay. She would marry Derek Whitaker and make the Double W her home. The realization brought both terror and exhilaration. the magnitude of the commitment warring with the rightness of the decision. She was in the kitchen, preparing a special breakfast to mark the occasion, when she heard horses in the yard. Looking out, she saw 3 riders approaching, 2 men and a woman. As they drew closer, Lucille recognized the woman's elegant riding habit and precise posture even before she saw her face. Her mother. Shock froze Lucille to the spot. What was Eleanor Garrett, now Eleanor Hughes, doing in Colorado territory? And how had she found the double W? The kitchen door opened behind her, and Derek entered, already dressed for the day's work. Lucille, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. My mother is here, Lucille whispered, still staring out the window. Derek joined her, watching as the riders dismounted. The woman in the green riding dress. With the 2 men? Yes, and I have no idea why. Derek's hand found the small of her back, a gesture of support that steadied her. Well, let's find out. They walked out onto the porch together as Eleanor Garrett Hughes ascended the steps, removing her riding gloves with practiced elegance. Behind her stood her new husband, a portly, balding man in an expensive but travel-worn suit, and a younger man Lucille didn't recognize. Lucille, darling, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Boston society. What a charming establishment you've found. Mother, Lucille managed, her voice steadier than she felt. This is unexpected. May I present Derek Whitaker, owner of the Double W Ranch? Derek stepped forward, extending his hand. Mrs. Hughes, welcome to my home. You've had a long journey. Eleanor's gaze assessed Derek, noting his simple clothes, his sun-browned skin, his youth, before she took his hand briefly. Indeed, when we learned of Lucille's hasty departure and her correspondence with you, we felt it our duty to intervene. Intervene, Lucille repeated, dread pooling in her stomach. Eleanor turned to the young man who had accompanied them. Lucille, you remember Thomas Caldwell? From the Caldwell shipping family? He's been asking after you in Boston. The young man stepped forward, bowing slightly. He was conventionally handsome in a pale, indoor way, with fashionable clothes and carefully arranged hair. Miss Garrett, he said, a pleasure to see you again. Lucille vaguely recalled meeting him at a society function, one of many eligible bachelors who had barely glanced in her direction. Mr. Caldwell, she acknowledged, confusion mounting. Eleanor beamed, as if orchestrating a perfect social triumph. Thomas has asked for your hand, Lucille. Isn't that wonderful? We can return to Boston immediately. I've already spoken with Reverend Phillips about a December wedding. Silence fell on the porch, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the soft nickering of the visitors' horses. Lucille felt Derek stiffen beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. You've come all this way to deliver a marriage proposal? Lucille finally asked, disbelief coloring her voice. To rescue you from an impulsive mistake, Eleanor corrected, her smile thinning. Really, Lucille, answering an advertisement? Moving to this wilderness? What were you thinking? I was thinking I might find happiness, Lucille replied quietly. Eleanor's gaze flicked dismissively around the ranch. Happiness? Darling, be reasonable. What kind of life could you have here? Thomas can provide you with a proper home in Boston, servants, social position. If I may, Derek interjected, his voice leveled despite the tension Lucille could feel radiating from him. You've had a long journey. Perhaps you'd like to come inside, have some coffee, and discuss this matter civilly. Eleanor looked as if she might refuse, but her husband, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. Thank you, young man. Most hospitable. He extended his hand. Herbert Hughes. And despite my wife's abruptness, we do appreciate your courtesy. Inside, an uncomfortable tableau formed in the living room. Eleanor perched on the edge of a chair as if afraid it might soil her dress, while Herbert settled more comfortably. Thomas stood near the window, his posture stiff. Derek and Lucille sat side by side on the small sofa, their proximity a silent statement. As Lucille served coffee from her mother's silver service, one of the few valuable items she had brought west, Eleanor launched into her explanation. When I discovered you had responded to a matrimonial advertisement, she said, distaste evident in her voice, I was beside myself with worry. Then Thomas called, asking after you, and it seemed providential. Thomas barely knew I existed in Boston, Lucille pointed out. Why this sudden interest? Thomas cleared his throat. Miss Garrett, I always admired you from afar. Your intelligence and modest demeanor set you apart from other young ladies." The practiced response rang false to Lucille's ears. How fortunate that my departure inspired such recognition of my qualities. Eleanor shot her a warning look. "Lucille, don't be difficult. The Caldwell family is highly respected. Thomas can provide security your Mr. Whitaker simply cannot match." Derek, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. "With respect, Mrs. Hughes, you know nothing about what I can or cannot provide for Lucille. I know you're a rancher in a territory that's barely civilized," Eleanor replied dismissively. "I know my daughter deserves better than to be a farmhand's wife." "Mother," Lucille exclaimed, mortified by her rudeness. "It's all right, Lucille," Derek said quietly. Then, to Eleanor, "Mrs. Hughes, the Double W Ranch covers 800 acres. We run 300 head of cattle and breed some of the finest quarter horses in the territory. I employ 6 hands year-round, more during roundup. The ranch is profitable and free of debt." His blue eyes held Eleanor steadily. "I may not have a shipping empire, but I can offer your daughter a good life." Herbert Hughes leaned forward, suddenly interested. 800 acres, you say? And all paid for. Impressive for a man your age." "My father built this ranch," Derek acknowledged. "I've merely continued his work." Eleanor waved a hand impatiently. "None of this matters. Lucille, you're returning to Boston with us. I won't have my daughter buried in this wilderness, married to a cowboy." The word held such contempt that Lucille felt her temper rising, a rare occurrence. "Mother, I am 22 years old. I make my own decisions now." "Decisions?" Eleanor scoffed. Running away to marry a stranger was not a decision. It was a desperate act. Fortunately, Thomas is willing to overlook this lapse in judgment. Thomas nodded magnanimously. "Everyone is entitled to an adventure, Miss Garrett. And now you've had yours." The condescension in his tone was the final straw. Lucille set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, rising to her feet. "Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your offer, but I must decline. Mother, I am not returning to Boston. My place is here now." Eleanor's face flushed with anger. "Don't be absurd, Lucille. What possible future could you have here? You know no one marries a girl of your proportions unless they're desperate. This man answered a matrimonial advertisement, for heaven's sake. He'd take anyone." The cruel words hung in the air. Lucille felt as if she'd been slapped, the old insecurities rushing back in a flood. Derek stood slowly, his face tight with controlled anger. "Mrs. Hughes," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I think you should leave now." "I will not be dismissed by—" "You will," Derek interrupted, "because this is my house, and you have insulted both me and your daughter beneath my roof." Herbert placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm. "Eleanor, perhaps we should continue this discussion later, when tempers have cooled." Eleanor shook off his hand, fixing her gaze on Lucille. "Is this truly what you want? To throw away a respectable offer for this rustic existence? Thomas is willing to marry you despite everything, Lucille. Do you understand how fortunate you are?" Lucille looked at Thomas, seeing for the first time the calculation behind his polite mask. "Why did you really come all this way, Mr. Caldwell?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "As I said, I've always admired—" "The truth, please," Lucille insisted. After a long pause, Thomas straightened his shoulders. "Very well. My father's shipping business has encountered temporary financial difficulties. Your stepfather has offered assistance, with certain conditions. My marriage to you being one of them," Lucille concluded, the pieces falling into place. She turned to her mother. "So this isn't about concern for my welfare at all. It's a business arrangement." Eleanor at least had the grace to look somewhat abashed. "It benefits everyone, Lucille. The Caldwells get their financing, you get a respectable husband, and I don't have to explain to Boston society why my daughter ran off to become a rancher's wife." "I think we're done here," Derek said firmly. "Mrs. Hughes, Mr. Caldwell, I believe the hotel in town can accommodate you tonight. I suggest you make use of it." Herbert stood, recognizing the finality in Derek's tone. "Come, Eleanor. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow." He nodded to Derek. "Thank you for your hospitality, limited though it was." As the visitors prepared to leave, Eleanor made one final appeal. "Lucille, please reconsider. You don't belong here." Lucille met her mother's gaze steadily. "That's where you're wrong, Mother. For the first time in my life, I feel I belong exactly where I am. After they had gone, silence filled the house. Lucille stood by the window, watching as the three riders headed back toward town, her emotions a tumultuous mix of anger, hurt, and surprising relief. Derek approached slowly, giving her space. "Are you all right?" "No," Lucille admitted honestly, turning to face him. "But I will be." "Your mother's words were cruel," Derek said, his voice gentle. "And untrue." Lucille gave a hollow laugh. "Were they?" "No one marries a fat girl, sir. That's what I told you on the porch that first day, and it's what I've heard my entire life." She wrapped her arms around herself protectively. "Perhaps Thomas's offer is the best I can hope for, a marriage of convenience, where my weight is overlooked for business advantages." Derek's expression darkened. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "Look at me, Lucille." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. "I didn't answer that advertisement because I was desperate for any wife," he said firmly. "I answered because I wanted a partner who shared my values, who would help build something meaningful here. When your letter came, with its honesty and intelligence, I chose you specifically from dozens of responses." His hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "And since you've been here, I've seen your strength, your kindness, your determination. I've watched you adapt to ranch life with grace. I've seen the way you've transformed this house back into a home." Lucille's heart pounded as Derek continued, his blue eyes intense on hers. "So no, your mother wasn't speaking truth. She was speaking the narrow prejudices of Boston society, prejudices I don't share." His voice softened. "I want you to stay, Lucille. Not because I'm desperate, but because in 2 short weeks, you've become essential to this place. To me." Tears pricked at Lucille's eyes. "How can you be so certain?" A small smile curved Derek's lips. "I told you, some things don't need long to recognize." Slowly, telegraphing his intentions, he lowered his head until his lips brushed hers in a gentle kiss. It was brief, almost chaste, but Lucille felt it down to her toes. When Derek pulled back, his expression was questioning, uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. "I want to stay," Lucille whispered, answering his unspoken question. "I want to be your wife, to make a life here." Relief and joy transformed Derek's face. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were precious. "Then stay," he murmured against her hair. "Stay and be my sunrise every morning." The next day, Lucille met her mother at the hotel in town, alone. The conversation was difficult but necessary. A lifetime of misunderstandings and hurt feelings couldn't be resolved in a single discussion, but they made a beginning. Eleanor didn't approve of Lucille's choice, but she grudgingly accepted it, particularly after Herbert quietly mentioned the impressive economics of Derek's operation. Thomas Caldwell departed for Boston immediately, his business proposal having failed. Herbert promised to visit again under better circumstances, and even Eleanor, seeing her daughter's determination, extended a stiff invitation to bring your young man east someday. 2 days later, Lucille Garrett became Lucille Whitaker in a simple ceremony in the town's small church. She wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Pemberton had helped alter and carried wildflowers that Derek had gathered that morning. The ranch hands stood as witnesses, old Pete sniffling suspiciously into his handkerchief. The wedding dinner was held at the Double W. The table extended to accommodate not only the ranch hands, but also several neighbors Derek had invited. Lucille had spent 2 days cooking, preparing a feast that had the guests returning for seconds and thirds. As twilight fell and the guests began to depart, Lucille found herself in the kitchen, storing leftover food. Derek came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a kiss to her neck. "Mrs. Whitaker," he murmured, "you should not be working on your wedding day." Lucille turned in his embrace, smiling up at her new husband. "I don't mind." Everyone enjoyed the meal. They did indeed. Old Pete declared your apple pie the best he's ever tasted, and he doesn't give praise lightly. Derek tucked a strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear. "You were right, you know." "About what?" "You really can cook," he said with a teasing smile. "Though that's the least of the reasons I married you." Lucille flushed with pleasure. "Oh, and what were the others?" Derek pretended to consider. "Well, there's your laugh. And your courage. Your kindness to everyone, including cranky old ranch hands." The way you roll up your sleeves when work needs doing without complaint. The way you look in the morning light. He bent to kiss her softly. I could continue, but we might be here all night. I wouldn't mind, Lucille whispered against his lips. Later, as they lay together in what was now their bedroom, the moonlight streaming through the window, Lucille thought of the journey that had brought her here, from a society that valued her only for what she wasn't, to a man who valued her precisely for what she was. What are you thinking? Derek asked, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. Lucille smiled in the darkness. I was thinking about what I said to you that first day on the porch. About no one marrying a fat girl. Derek propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with serious eyes. And I was thinking about your reply, how it changed everything. She reached up to touch his face, still marveling that she could. You didn't deny what I was. You didn't offer empty platitudes. You simply said they were fools, and made me believe that someone could want me exactly as I am. Derek turned his head to press a kiss into her palm. Not someone. Me. I want you exactly as you are, Lucille Whitaker. Today, and all the days to come. As she drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, Lucille thought of the girl who had stood on the train platform in Boston, full of fear and desperate hope. How astonished that girl would be to know that in a small ranch house in Colorado territory, she would finally find not just acceptance, but love, and the certainty that she belonged.